Let me introduce myself. I am a historian and I make videos about the history of slavery and the slave trade. In this series, we are looking at country by country, territory by territory, and in this episode, we will look at the history of slavery in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a long and complicated history with slavery, and while there is no doubt that its history is indelibly linked with that of the transatlantic slave trade, the story actually starts long before that. Before the Age of Empire, during Roman Britain, from 43 AD to c. 410 AD, chattel slavery was a well-established institution. Slaves could be bought and sold and were considered property. Roman law applied to them and they had few rights. Most slaves were captives from Britain's many wars with neighboring tribes, but slaves were also imported from across the empire, including from North Africa and the Near East. After the Romans withdrew from Britain, the country went through a tumultuous period known as the Anglo-Saxon era, lasting from the 5th to the 11th century. During this time, slavery continued and people could be enslaved in a number of ways, including through debt, crime, and warfare. Some Anglo-Saxons even practiced a kind of indentured servitude, where free men and women would voluntarily bind themselves to a lord for a set period of time in exchange for protection or training. However, these arrangements often resembled slavery and many of those who entered into them ended up being treated as property. In 862, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the sale of 150 English slaves to the Viking trading group of the Danelaw who shipped them abroad. Some were taken to other parts of Europe and some as far away as the Middle East. In 991, the Chronicle reports that 400 English were captured and sold into slavery by the Vikings. As the medieval period progressed and England came under the rule of a series of monarchs, slavery slowly declined. With the Norman conquest of 1066, the most prevalent form of unfreedom evolved into serfdom. Although still a highly restrictive system, serfs were not considered property and could not be bought or sold like chattel slaves. But they were tied to the land and beholden to their lord. They could not leave the manor without permission, and their labor was owed to their lord in exchange for protection and the right to a small portion of the land's produce. By the end of the medieval period, serfdom gradually faded in England, replaced by more contractual forms of tenancy and labor. The Tudor monarchs saw England begin to carve out an overseas empire, and this soon became inextricably linked with the Atlantic slave trade. By the 16th century, England had begun transporting enslaved Africans to the New World. Initially, this was on a small scale, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, England became one of the biggest players in the trade. As the Royal African Company's charter expired in 1698, giving way to independent British merchants and privateering, Liverpool, Bristol, and London became major hubs for the slave trade. Their prosperity was directly linked to the brutal exploitation of human beings. Under British colonial policies, slavery was enshrined as an institution. Enslaved people were considered property and denied any rights or freedoms. Chattel slavery was never formally codified into English common law within England itself, but enslaved people brought to Britain by their owners faced a precarious legal status, effectively remaining in bondage. Meanwhile, as Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade expanded, so did its vulnerability to the same forces of violence and coercion that it was inflicting on others. From the 16th to the early 19th centuries, the English and Irish coasts were repeatedly targeted by North African slavers, commonly known as Barbary pirates, operating from ports like Algiers, Tunis, and which were controlled by the Ottoman Empire. These raiders would seize coastal towns and villages along the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Many of these attacks occurred along the coasts of Devon and Cornwall, but Ireland was particularly vulnerable and suffered most. Between 1625 and 1702, at least 11,000 Irish were taken captive and sold in the slave markets of North Africa. One of the most notorious raids happened in 1631 when over 200 inhabitants of Baltimore, County Cork, were captured and taken into slavery. Enslaved people subjected to the Barbary pirates came from all levels of society and ranged in age from infants to the elderly. They were forced into hard labor, often working as galley slaves, pulling the oars of ships for months on end, or were sold into sexual slavery. Some were able to purchase their freedom, but many died from exhaustion, mistreatment, disease, and starvation. These events demonstrate a critical yet lesser-known aspect of the slave trade, highlighting how the English and Irish were both perpetrators and victims of the global system of slavery. While the transatlantic slave trade flourished, England became a hub for the buying and selling of enslaved people. At the same time, people of African descent living in England faced severe discrimination and persecution. They were denied basic rights and subjected to harsh laws restricting their movement and opportunities. Despite these challenges, enslaved people bravely resisted their bondage in various ways. Some attempted to escape, while others rebelled against their captors. Perhaps the most famous example was the 1739 attempt to run away, led by the enslaved man Kwame Nkrumah. However, for every successful escape, many others were caught and punished severely. Throughout the 18th century, a powerful abolitionist movement began to gain momentum in Britain. Abolitionists were a diverse group of people who believed that slavery was morally wrong and should be abolished. Their ranks included religious figures like Granville Sharp, John Wesley, and John Newton, as well as intellectuals and politicians such as Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce. Together, they relentlessly campaigned for the end of slavery, organizing protests, petitioning Parliament, and most importantly, changing hearts and minds. In 1772, the Somerset v. Stewart case came before the English courts. This was a landmark legal case in which enslaved people aboard a ship in England successfully sued for their freedom. Lord Chief Justice Mansfield's judgment declared that chattel slavery was so odious that it could not be supported by the common law of England. This decision effectively freed all enslaved people in England and paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. The public outcry against the horrors of the slave trade intensified. Mass petitions were circulated, calling on Parliament to take action. People boycotted goods produced through slavery, such as sugar, and participated in public demonstrations and protests. In response to this growing pressure, the British government took steps to address the issue. One of the first significant legislative acts was the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which outlawed the slave trade within the British Empire. While it did not immediately end slavery itself, it was a crucial step towards recognizing the humanity of enslaved people and curbing the demand for them. Finally, in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, which outlawed slavery throughout most of the British Empire. This monumental legislation emancipated hundreds of thousands of enslaved people in the Caribbean and South America. However, it is important to note that this act was not without controversy. While it granted freedom to enslaved people, it also provided compensation to slave owners for the loss of their property. This controversial provision aimed to mitigate the economic impact of abolition on the wealthy landowners who relied on enslaved labor. After 1807, Britain went to war against slavery to enforce abolition. The Royal Navy established a dedicated squadron to patrol key regions of the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. This naval force played a pivotal role in disrupting the international slave trade and rescuing countless individuals from a life of captivity. By the early 19th century, the British Navy had become a formidable force in the fight against slavery. The squadron's operations were primarily focused on intercepting slave ships and liberating their human cargo. On many occasions, naval vessels would chase down suspected slave ships, board them, and forcibly remove enslaved people, providing them with food, water, and medical care. These brave sailors faced dangerous situations as they confronted fellow British citizens and ships involved in the slave trade. There were instances of violence and resistance, but the Navy's commitment to enforcing abolition remained steadfast. By the end of the 19th century, the efforts of the Royal Navy and the implementation of the Slavery Abolition Act resulted in a significant decline in the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved people were freed, and the squadron's operations contributed to dismantling this brutal practice. So why does any of this matter? Well, Britain's role in the slave trade and its subsequent efforts to abolish it are integral to understanding the history of slavery worldwide. England's journey from participating in the transatlantic slave trade to becoming a leading force in abolition demonstrates the complexities of this institution and the evolution of societal attitudes towards it. Furthermore, acknowledging the Barbary pirate raids highlights the interconnectedness of slavery and reminds us that enslaved people were not just victims of one system but endured multiple forms of captivity. Finally, understanding the legacy of slavery in England and the UK is crucial for addressing ongoing issues of racial inequality and discrimination. It is a reminder of the enduring impact of historical injustices and the need for continued efforts towards a more equitable future.